My name is Layla Al-Rashid, and this is the story of how words cost me my face, my voice, and my country, but couldn't destroy my soul. Before we go any further, I need to ask you something. Wherever you are right now, whether you're in the United States, Australia, Kenya, India, Germany, or anywhere else on this earth, please leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. We are a global family, and we need to lift each other up in prayer. Because what I'm about to share with you shows how dangerous the truth can be when spoken in the wrong place at the wrong time. I was 26 years old when everything I knew about myself was burned away. Fez is one of the oldest cities in Morocco, a place where history breathes through narrow medieval streets and the call to prayer echoes off ancient walls. The university there, Al-Qarawiyyin, is the oldest continuously operating university in the world. It's a city proud of its Islamic heritage, its scholarship, its cultural sophistication. I grew up in that city loving words. From the time I was a little girl, I would string sentences together like beads on a necklace, trying to capture the world in language. By the time I was in university studying literature, I'd fallen in love with poetry, not the classical kind they taught us in classes, but spoken word poetry. Raw, honest, contemporary poetry that dealt with real life. I started performing at underground arts venues in Fez, small cafes, cultural centers, places where young people gathered to hear music and poetry that pushed boundaries. I wrote about women's rights, about social inequality, about the gap between what we claimed to believe and how we actually lived. My performances were provocative, sometimes controversial, but that was the point. Art should make you uncomfortable. It should make you think. People knew me in Fez's art scene. Some loved my work. Others hated it. But they listened. For my master's thesis, I was researching medieval Andalusian poetry, that beautiful period when Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived together in Spain and influenced each other's art and philosophy. During my research, I stumbled across translated texts of dialogues between Christian and Muslim scholars from that era. I was fascinated by how they engaged with each other's ideas, how they debated theology with respect and intellectual rigor. In those texts, I encountered descriptions of Jesus from Christian perspectives that were completely different from what I'd learned growing up. In Islam, we're taught that Jesus was a prophet, nothing more. But these Christian texts portrayed him as God incarnate, as someone who claimed to be the way and the truth and the life. I became obsessed with understanding this difference. I started reading the Gospels in Arabic, comparing them with what the Quran said about Isa. I told myself it was purely academic research, intellectual curiosity. But something deeper was stirring in my heart. Around that same time, I met Marcus. He was a Belgian aid worker who'd come to Morocco working with an NGO that helped rural communities develop sustainable agriculture. We met at a poetry reading where I was performing. Afterward, he approached me and told me my work moved him, that I had a gift for making people feel truth rather than just hear it. We became friends. Then we became more than friends. Marcus was a Christian, not in a casual, cultural way, but in a way that actually shaped how he lived. He talked about his faith naturally, the way you talk about someone you loved. He prayed before meals. He read his Bible in the mornings. He served people without expecting recognition or reward. I was drawn to that authenticity. And yes, I was drawn to him. We kept our relationship secret, of course. A Muslim woman involved with a Christian foreign man. That would have been scandalous enough even without the religious implications. We met in private, in his apartment or in quiet corners of the Medina where no one knew us. Marcus gave me books about Christianity. He answered my endless questions. He never pressured me to convert, but he also didn't hide what he believed. He told me that Jesus had changed his life, that he'd found freedom and purpose in following him. For months, I wrestled with what I was learning. Part of me wondered if I was just romanticizing Christianity because I was in love with a Christian man. Was this real spiritual seeking, or was I just trying to align myself with someone I cared about? But then I had an experience that clarified everything. I was reading the Gospel of John late one night in my apartment. I came to the part where Jesus tells his disciples that he is the good shepherd who lays down his life for his sheep. That no one takes his life from him. He lays it down of his own accord. Something about that image broke through all my intellectual defenses. A God who chose to suffer. A God who laid down power instead of wielding it. A God who loved so much he voluntarily died. I realized in that moment that this wasn't about Marcus. This wasn't about rebellion or romance or intellectual fascination. This was about recognizing truth when I encountered it. I prayed that night, awkwardly, uncertainly, and told Jesus that if he was really who he claimed to be, I wanted to follow him. I wanted to know this love that was strong enough to die for enemies. I felt something shift in my chest, like a locked door swinging open. I didn't tell anyone except Marcus. I continued going to the mosque with my family. I continued my studies. I continued performing my poetry. But inside, everything had changed. I was reading the Bible every day. I was praying to Jesus. I was slowly, carefully learning what it meant to follow him. I wanted to express what I was experiencing, but I knew I had to be careful. So I wrote a poem. It was called The Shepherd, and on the surface, it was about searching for guidance and finding unexpected love. But woven throughout were references that any Christian would recognize. Language about laying down one's life, about being a sheep who was lost and then found, about a love that pursues rather than demands. I performed it at a poetry night at a small cultural center in Fez. The audience responded powerfully. Some people were moved to tears. It felt like the most honest thing I'd ever written. Someone recorded the performance on their phone and posted it online. Within 3 days, it had gone viral in Morocco. Thousands of views, then tens of thousands. People were analyzing the lyrics, debating what I meant. And then someone, I never found out who, posted a comment suggesting that the poem was about Jesus, that I must have converted to Christianity. Once that interpretation was out there, others picked it up. Religious leaders started commenting on it. Conservative news sites published articles. People started digging into my background, my social media, my associations. Within a week, everyone in Morocco seemed to know that Layla al-Rashid, the controversial poet from Fez, had become a Christian. The university expelled me. They said my continued enrollment would cause too much controversy, that they had to consider the comfort of other students. My thesis advisor, who'd supervised my work for 2 years, told me through an email that he could no longer be associated with me professionally. My family was worse. My father called me home for a family meeting. When I arrived, my mother, my father, my 2 brothers, my sister, my aunts and uncles were all there. My father told me that the rumors had brought shame on our family name, that I had to publicly renounce this nonsense immediately. I told him I couldn't do that I had genuinely come to believe Jesus was who he claimed to be. The room erupted. My mother wept. My father shouted. My older brother called me a traitor and a fool. But the worst was seeing my younger brother Yusef's face. He was 18, and we'd always been close. He looked at me with such confusion and hurt, like I'd betrayed him personally. My father gave me an ultimatum: renounce this conversion publicly, or leave and never come back. I left. My family issued a public statement disowning me. They said I was no longer their daughter, no longer part of their family, and that they rejected my choices completely. They did this, I later learned, to protect themselves, to show the community that they didn't support me, so they wouldn't face social or professional consequences. But it still broke something in me. Especially knowing that Yusef, my sweet little brother who used to follow me everywhere, was now forbidden from even speaking to me. The death threat started almost immediately. Messages on social media telling me I deserved to die for apostasy. Anonymous calls to my phone describing in detail how traitors should be punished. Letters slipped under my door with violent promises. I moved in with Marcus, though we both knew that made me even more of a target. I stopped performing. I stopped going to the places I used to frequent. I was essentially in hiding in my own city. Marcus and his organization were making plans to help me leave Morocco, to apply for asylum in Europe. But paperwork takes time. We needed a few more weeks. We didn't have a few more weeks. I was walking back to Marcus's apartment one evening, just after sunset. The streets were busy with people heading home from work. I was being careful, staying in crowded areas, but I needed to pick up some groceries. As I turned down a somewhat quieter street, 2 men approached me from behind. I didn't see them until it was too late. One of them grabbed me. The other threw something in my face. The pain was instant and indescribable. It felt like my face was on fire, like someone had pressed a burning coal against my skin and held it there. I screamed, but even screaming hurt because whatever they'd thrown on me was burning my mouth, my throat. They ran. I collapsed on the street, clawing at my face, trying to make the burning stop. People gathered around me, but no one touched me at first. I heard someone say it was acid. Someone else called an ambulance. I don't remember much about the ambulance ride or the first hours at the hospital. The pain was so overwhelming that I kept passing out and coming back to consciousness in waves. The doctors told me later that I was lucky. If the acid had been a stronger concentration or if I'd gotten to the hospital any later, the damage would have been much worse. But not as bad as it could have been, was still catastrophic. The acid had severely burned the left side of my face, my neck, and part of my chest where it had run down. My left eye was damaged but not destroyed. The burns in my mouth and throat had damaged my vocal cords. When I tried to speak, what came out was a hoarse, raspy whisper, nothing like my voice had been before. They'd taken my face. They'd taken my voice. They'd taken the two things that made me who I was. I stayed in the hospital for 3 weeks. Marcus was there every day, but even his presence couldn't ease the horror of what had happened. Every time they changed my bandages, I wanted to die. The pain was excruciating, but worse was knowing what I would look like when the bandages finally came off. The Moroccan police barely investigated. One officer suggested I'd brought this on myself with my choices. Another implied that perhaps I should leave the country for my own safety, as if that excused the people who'd done this to me. Marcus's organization expedited my asylum application. Within a month of the attack, I was on a plane to Belgium, leaving behind everything I'd ever known. I arrived in Brussels disfigured, traumatized, and voiceless. The refugee center housed me temporarily while my asylum claim was processed. I spent most of my time in my small room, staring at the walls, refusing to look at myself in the mirror. I was angry, furious, at the men who'd attacked me, yes, but also at God. I'd given up everything to follow Jesus. And what had he done? He'd let them destroy me. He'd let them take my face, my voice, my identity as a poet. What kind of God allows that to happen to someone who's just trying to follow him? I stopped praying. I stopped reading my Bible. I told Marcus, who'd also relocated to Belgium, that I wasn't sure I believed anymore. That maybe faith wasn't worth this price. Marcus listened without judgment. He told me he couldn't imagine my pain, but that it was okay to be angry at God. That God was big enough to handle my rage and my doubts. I didn't believe him. The nightmares were constant. I would wake up feeling the burning on my face again, smelling the chemical smell of the acid, hearing the men's footsteps as they ran away. I developed severe anxiety. I couldn't go outside without panicking. I couldn't be in crowds. I jumped at every unexpected sound. A social worker at the refugee center referred me to a trauma counselor who specialized in working with torture and assault survivors. Her name was Dr. Vermeer, and she was patient with me even when I didn't want to talk, even when I sat in her office in hostile silence. Eventually, I started talking. About the attack. About losing my family. About my anger at God. About feeling like a monster when I finally forced myself to look in the mirror and saw the scarred, twisted skin where my face used to be. Dr. Vermeer suggested I try art therapy. I told her I wasn't an artist, I was a poet and I couldn't speak anymore, so that was over. She said there were other ways to express what was inside me. That trauma needed to be externalized somehow or it would destroy me from within. I started attending art therapy sessions at a community center for asylum seekers. At first, I just sat there watching other people paint or draw or sculpt. But slowly I started experimenting. I couldn't make beautiful art. I had no training, but I could make honest art. I created a series of collages using torn paper, photographs, and found materials. They were angry, chaotic, painful pieces that expressed what words couldn't anymore. One piece was a self-portrait made entirely of shattered mirror fragments. Another was a poem I'd written before the attack, burned at the edges and covered with red paint like blood. The other asylum seekers in the group understood. They'd all lost things too: countries, families, identities, bodies. We didn't have to explain our trauma to each other. We just witnessed it in each other's art. There was a Syrian woman named Rania who'd been tortured for being a Christian. An Iranian man named Dariush who'd fled after his conversion was discovered. An Eritrean woman named Sinait who'd escaped religious persecution and trafficking. We formed an unlikely family, bonded by loss and survival. They helped me see that my scars didn't make me a monster. They made me a survivor. That my damaged voice didn't mean I had nothing to say. That my story, even if I had to tell it differently now, was still worth telling. One day, about 8 months after arriving in Belgium, I wrote something. Not a spoken-word poem like I used to write, but something quieter, more internal. I showed it to the art therapy group, and they encouraged me to share it more widely. I started a blog where I posted my writing, poems, reflections, raw, honest descriptions of my journey. I posted photos of my art. I didn't hide my scars in the pictures. I let people see what had been done to me. The response shocked me. People from all over the world started reading and commenting. Other persecution survivors reached out to tell me their stories. People said my honesty gave them permission to be honest about their own trauma. I realized something I hadn't expected. My scars told a story. A story about the cost of faith. A story about violence and survival. A story about what it means to keep going even when everything's been taken from you. I could tell that story even without my old voice. Maybe especially without my old voice, because now there was no performance, no polish, no hiding behind beautiful words. Just raw truth. Slowly, so slowly I barely noticed it happening, I began to heal. Not completely. The nightmares still came. The anxiety still flared. Looking in the mirror was still hard. But I was learning to live with the scars, both the visible ones and the invisible ones. And I was learning that God hadn't abandoned me in that moment on the street in Fez. He'd been there, suffering with me. And he'd been with me in every dark moment since. In the hospital, on the plane, in the refugee center, in Dr. Vermeer's office, in the art therapy room. He hadn't prevented my suffering, but he'd walked through it with me. And somehow, he was using even my broken voice and scarred face to tell a story that needed to be told. I'm 28 now. I live in Brussels. I still attend the art therapy group. I still see Dr. Vermeer every 2 weeks. I still have days when the weight of what I've lost crushes me. I'll never perform spoken word poetry the way I used to. I'll never have my face back. I'll never go home to Fez. But I'm alive. And I'm still creating. And I'm still following Jesus, even though the cost has been almost unbearable. Because here's what I've learned. Faith doesn't protect you from suffering. But it gives you something to hold on to when suffering comes. It reminds you that your story isn't over, that redemption is possible even in ruins, that scars can become testimonies instead of just tragedies. My younger brother Youssef found me online 6 months ago. He sent me a careful, coded message asking if I was okay. We've been communicating secretly ever since. He tells me he's been reading what I write. That he's asking questions. That he misses me. I don't know if he'll ever be able to publicly acknowledge me again. I don't know if my family will ever soften. But having even that small connection back is more than I'd hoped for. Every day, I choose to keep going. Some days, that choice is harder than others. But I keep choosing it. Because I'm learning that courage isn't the absence of fear or pain. It's continuing to move forward even when you're terrified and hurting. And somehow, impossibly, there's still beauty in my life. Different beauty than before. Scarred beauty. Broken beauty. But beauty nonetheless.